Paris, Montmartre, winter, 1999. The attic smelled of turpentine, stale baguettes, and the damp, metallic scent of snow melting on a tin roof. It was a poverty that felt like royalty. Milan sat cross-legged on the mattress that occupied most of the floor, her breath misting in the freezing air. She wore 3 sweaters, but her hands, long, elegant, and stained with Prussian blue, were bare. "Stop moving," she murmured, dipping her brush into a jar of water that was slowly freezing over. Jae-hyun lay on his stomach, his shirt discarded in a heap. He was shivering, the goose flesh rising on his golden brown skin, but he didn't complain. "We couldn't afford canvas this week. We barely had enough francs for the radiator. So for the last 3 days, he had been her surface." "I'm not moving," Jae-hyun whispered, his voice vibrating against the mattress. "I'm freezing. There's a difference. Art requires sacrifice, Jae. Art requires a heater, Milan." She smiled, a small, private thing, and dragged the brush down the curve of his spine. She was painting a galaxy on his back, swirling indigos and violets into his skin. He was the heir to the Hansong Empire, a boy destined to rule a conglomerate that owned half of Seoul. But here, in this squalid 6th arrondissement walk-up, he was just Jae. He was her muse. He was her gravity. "Read the line again," she commanded softly. Jae-hyun turned his head, his cheek pressing against the rough wool of the blanket. He looked at her with eyes so dark they swallowed the dim light of the room. "I have measured out my life with coffee spoons," he recited, his English perfect, shaped by boarding schools she could never afford. "No," she corrected, painting a star on his shoulder blade. "The other one, the one you wrote." He hesitated. "We are not made of atoms. We are made of the stories we hide from the sun." Milan stopped painting. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the kind of love that feels dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to the wet paint on his shoulder, staining her lips blue. "We don't have to hide," she whispered against his skin. "Not here." The door rattled. Jae-hyun flinched. The magic broke. He sat up, the galaxy on his back stretching and distorting. He grabbed his shirt, pulling it over the wet paint, ruining her work. "Where are you going?" Milan asked, sitting back, sudden dread pooling in her stomach. "I forgot," he said, his voice tight. I have to meet a friend, just for an hour." He wouldn't look at her. He didn't meet a friend. He met a man in a black suit at a cafe 3 blocks away. A man who didn't drink his coffee. A man who worked for his father. "The chairman is losing patience, Jae-hyun," the man said, sliding a manila envelope across the zinc table. "I told you," Jae-hyun said, his hands clenched under the table. "I'm not coming back. I'm studying literature. I'm in love. Tell him I renounce the inheritance. Give it to my brother." The man in the suit smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Your brother is obedient, but he is weak. The chairman wants you." The man opened the envelope. Inside were photos, not of Jae-hyun, of Milan. Milan buying apples, Milan smoking on the fire escape, and then a zoomed-in high-resolution photo of Milan's hands holding a brush. "She has remarkable talent," the man said smoothly. "Delicate bone structure. It would be a tragedy if she were to have an accident. The loan sharks in this district are so aggressive. They like to use hammers on artists who don't pay their debts." The world tilted on its axis. The noise of the Parisian street fell away, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in Jae-hyun's ears. "If you are not on the plane to Seoul tonight," the man continued, tapping the photo of her hands, "we will make sure she never holds a brush again. We will crush them, Jae-hyun, bone by bone." Jae-hyun stared at the photo. He thought of the galaxy she had just painted on his spine. He thought of her fingers, interlaced with his, warm and strong. "I'll go," Jae-hyun rasped, the air leaving his lungs. "Don't touch her. I'll go." "Good. But she must not follow you. If she follows you to Korea, the deal is void." The man leaned in. "Make her hate you, boy. Break her heart so thoroughly that she never looks for you again. That is the only way to save her." The performance of cruelty begins. It was dark when he returned to the attic. The smell of oil paint was overwhelming. Milan was standing in the center of the room, wiping her hands on a rag. Behind her, on the easel, stood the blue loft. It was finished. It was a masterpiece. It was an oil painting of their attic, but the perspective was from the ceiling looking down. In the painting, two figures were tangled in the bed sheets, one black, one golden, surrounded by empty wine bottles and books. It captured the cold, the hunger, and the blinding heat of their love. It was the best thing she had ever created. "Jay!" she beamed, her face smeared with charcoal. "I finished it. I was just about to run down and get wine. Look." She stepped aside to reveal the canvas. Jae-hyun stood in the doorway. He felt like he was bleeding out, dying on his feet. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run to her, to hold her, to drag her to the airport and flee to somewhere his father couldn't find them. Bone by bone, the voice in his head echoed. He walked into the room. He didn't take off his coat. He kept his shoes on, tracking mud onto the floor she kept so clean. "You finished it," he said. His voice was unrecognizable, cold, flat, the voice of the chairman. "Yes," Milan said, her smile faltering. Is everything okay?" Jae-hyun walked past her. He picked up a jar of dirty paint water, black sludge. He looked at the painting. Then, without blinking, he splashed the water over her sketchbooks on the floor. "Jay!" Milan screamed, diving for the books. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning up," he said. He walked over to the easel. He stared at the blue loft. "It's charming, I suppose. In a naive way." Milan stood up, trembling. "What is wrong with you?" Jae-hyun turned to her. He summoned every ounce of self-hatred he possessed and projected it onto her. He looked at her, not with love, but with boredom. "My father called." He lied, smoothie. "My vacation is over, Milan. I'm going back to Seoul, to my real life." "Vacation?" Milan whispered. The word hit her like a physical blow. "We've been living here for 6 months. We're soulmates, Jay. You said—" "I said a lot of things," he cut her off. He laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "I'm a writer, Milan. I needed material. I wanted to see what it felt like to be destitute, to live in the filth with a starving artist. It was a fascinating experiment." He walked closer to her. She backed away until she hit the wall. He loomed over her, smelling of expensive cologne and betrayal. "But the experiment is over. I'm bored." He gestured vaguely to her art. "And honestly, this painting, it's derivative. It's just sentimental trash. You're mediocre, Milan. You always were." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and fast. "You're lying," she choked out. "You loved me this morning. You let me paint the stars on your back." "I let you paint on me because I was cold," he sneered. "Don't confuse pity with passion." He grabbed the blue loft off the easel. "What are you doing?" she cried. "Taking this," he said, tucking the canvas under his arm. "I paid the rent for 6 months. Consider this my receipt. Maybe it'll be worth something one day, as a curiosity piece. The poor period." He turned and walked out the door. He didn't look back. If he had looked back, he would have collapsed. He walked down the 4 flights of stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Hate me," he prayed. "Please, God, let her hate me." Milan stood frozen for 10 seconds. The shock paralyzed her. Then the agony hit. Jae-hyun! She bolted. She ran out of the apartment without a coat, flying down the stairs, tripping, scraping her shin, scrambling back up. She burst out onto the cobblestone street. It was pouring rain now, freezing, sleeting rain that turned the Paris streets into black mirrors. She saw him. He was getting into a taxi at the end of the block. Jae-hyun! She screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. Jae, wait! She ran. She ran until her lungs burned, her sneakers splashing through icy puddles. The taxi began to pull away. Don't leave me, she sobbed, reaching out as if she could grab the bumper of the car. Please tell me it's a joke. Jae! The taxi accelerated. She chased it for 2 blocks, her legs pumping with desperation, until her chest gave out and she collapsed onto the wet pavement, gasping, soaking wet, watching the taillights blur into the red haze of the Paris night. She curled into a ball on the street, wailing, her hands clutching her chest where her heart used to be. Inside the taxi, Jae-hyun didn't look back. He sat facing forward, the blue loft clutched against his chest so tight the wooden frame dug into his skin. His face was a mask of stone. Are you okay, monsieur? The driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. Jae-hyun didn't answer. He couldn't speak. He was staring at his own reflection in the dark glass. Silent, racking sobs shook his shoulders, tears streaming down his face, washing away the stoic mask. He brought his hand to his mouth to stifle the scream building in his throat. He looked down at his own hand, the hand that had just shattered hers to save them. I will wait, he vowed silently to the disappearing city. If it takes 10 years, if it takes 20, I will build a fortress so strong that no one can ever touch your hands again, and then I will come back. The taxi turned the corner, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Her, New York City, present day. Milan stood in the center of the Guggenheim, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't sipped in an hour. She was 39, and she was a weapon carved from ice. Around her, the elite of New York's art scene buzzed like flies. They were terrified of her, and they worshipped her. They paid millions for her canvases. Massive, violent explosions of crimson, vermilion, and arterial scarlet. Critics called her work visceral and unflinching. They said she painted the rage of the modern woman. They were wrong. She was just painting the same wound over and over again, trying to get the poison out. She hadn't touched a tube of blue paint since 1999. Blue was hope. Blue was a lie. Milan, her agent, David, approached cautiously. He knew better than to touch her arm. There's a situation with the private commission. Milan didn't turn. She was staring at her latest piece, Autopsy of a Memory. I told you, David, I don't do portraits. I don't do commissions. I paint what I want, when I want. It's Hansong Corporation, David said, his voice dropping an octave. From Seoul. They're offering $10 million, Milan, plus expenses, for a 3-month residency. Milan finally turned. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of warmth. Seoul, she repeated, the word tasting like ash. Tell them to go to hell. I don't set foot in that country. I tried. David swallowed hard. But the courier, he left this for you. He said the chairman insisted. He handed her a small white envelope. Milan took it with a scoff, intending to tear it in half without opening it. But her thumb brushed against the texture of a photograph inside. She pulled it out. The air left the room. The chatter of the gallery faded into a dull roar, like blood rushing in her ears. It was a Polaroid. Old, grainy, the edges yellowed. It showed a painting hanging on a wall in a dark room. The perspective was from the ceiling, looking down at a bed tangled with sheets. The blue loft. Her hands began to shake. She flipped the photo over. On the back, in elegant, familiar handwriting that she hadn't seen in 20 years, were 4 words in black ink. Come claim what was stolen. Rage, hot and blinding, flooded her veins. It wasn't the dull ache she had lived with for 2 decades. This was fresh, volcanic fury. He still had it. He had kept the trophy of her humiliation, and now he was dangling it like a treat for a dog. "David," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Yes?" "Book the jet," she said, her eyes fixed on the photo. "I'm going to Seoul." "For the money?" "No." She crushed the Polaroid in her fist. "To burn the whole city down." The elevator ride to the penthouse of the Hanseong Tower took a full minute. Her ears popped. When the door slid open, Milan stepped into a world that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The penthouse was a cavern of glass and steel, suspended 50 stories above the Han River. It was night, and the city lights of Seoul sprawled below like a circuit board, cold and indifferent. The air inside was recycled, chilled to a precise temperature, and smelled faintly of sandalwood and loneliness. "Hello," she called out. Her voice echoed, bouncing off the marble floors. Silence. She walked deeper into the apartment. There were no personal photos, no clutter, no signs of life, just expensive Italian furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. She turned a corner into a long, dimly lit corridor that stretched toward the master wing. She took 3 steps and stopped dead. Her breath hitched in a painful gasp. The walls. They were covered. To her left, The Scream in Scarlet, 2005. To her right, Veins of the City, 2012. Further down, the massive triptych Betrayal at Dawn, 2018. Milan walked down the hallway, her legs feeling like lead. It wasn't just a few pieces. It was everything. Every major work she had sold over the last 20 years. Every painting she had blindly shipped to shell companies in Zurich, the Cayman Islands, Singapore. They had all ended up here. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the canvas of a painting she'd made the year she had a miscarriage, a chaotic swirl of dark red and black. She had sold it to a private collector because she couldn't bear to look at it. He had bought it. "You've been watching me," she whispered to the empty hall. The realization made her skin crawl. It was perverse. He hadn't just moved on. He had built a shrine to her pain. He had surrounded himself with the physical manifestations of the heart he broke. It was the ultimate act of control. Even when they were apart, he owned her grief. She reached the end of the hall. There, in a spotlight, hung the only painting that wasn't red, the blue loft. It looked exactly as it had the day he stole it. The blue was vibrant, the love in the brushstrokes undeniable. It was a window into a life that had been murdered. "It catches the light well in this room, doesn't it?" Milan spun around. Jae-hyun stood at the end of the corridor, framed by the floor-to-ceiling window behind him. He was not the boy in the oversized sweater who used to read her poetry. That boy was dead. The man standing before her was the titan of industry. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit him like armor, tailored to hide any weakness. His hair was impeccably styled, but silver had claimed the temples. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were dead. They were deep, exhausted wells that held no light, no joy, only an infinite fatigue. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand. Milan didn't scream. She didn't cry. She straightened her spine, pulling her coat tighter around her like a shield. She let 20 years of ice sharpen her voice. "You look expensive, Jae-hyun," she said. It was an insult. "And you look—" He paused, his gaze traveling over her face, drinking her in as if he had been dying of thirst for 2 decades. "You look exactly as I remembered, except you don't smile anymore." I stopped smiling the day you left me on the street like garbage, she spat. She gestured violently to the walls. What is this? Is this some sick joke? You steal my youth, you steal my work, and now you buy my grief and hang it on your wall like a trophy? Do you get off on surrounding yourself with my hatred? Jae-hyun took a sip of his drink. He didn't defend himself. He walked slowly toward her, the sound of his dress shoes clicking against the marble. I didn't buy them to mock you, Milan, he said, his voice a low rumble, rougher than she remembered. I bought them because they were the only things in the world that had a pulse. Everything else in my life is gray. Your anger? It was the only color I had. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to smell the scent on her, close enough for her to see the fine lines around his eyes. You're a monster, she whispered, vibrating with fury. You destroyed us for this, for a tower, for a suit. Yes, he agreed simply. I am. He set the glass down on a side table. His hand, the right one, trembled. It was a subtle, rhythmic shake. He clenched his fist to hide it, but she saw. Why bring me here? She demanded. If you wanted to humiliate me, you could have done it over the phone. I'm tired, Milan, he said softly. He looked at the blue loft over her shoulder. I have built an empire. I have crushed my competitors. I have done everything my father asked of me, and I am hollow. He turned his gaze back to her. The intensity of it pinned her to the floor. Paint me, he said. Milan blinked. Excuse me? The contract, the commission, he said. Paint a portrait of me, the real me, not the CEO, not the heir. Capture the man who did this to you. Look at me, Milan. Really look at me, with those eyes that used to see everything. I would rather paint the devil, she hissed. If you can find a soul in here to paint, he tapped his chest right over his heart, I will give you the blue loft. I will sign over the deed to the painting, and I will vanish from your life. I will never buy another piece. I will be a ghost. And if I refuse? Then I keep the painting, he said, his voice hardening back into the CEO's armor. And you leave knowing that a piece of your soul stays in this prison with me forever. Milan looked at the painting of their Paris attic, the last evidence that she had once been capable of love. Then she looked at the man who had killed that girl. Fine, she said, her voice cutting like a razor. I'll paint you. But don't expect a portrait, Jae-hyun. I'm going to paint an autopsy. Jae-hyun picked up his glass again. For a second, she thought she saw relief flash across his face. Or perhaps it was just the shadow of the whiskey. I expect nothing less, he whispered. Welcome to hell, Milan. Seoul, late autumn. The studio was a glass-walled cage. Milan had insisted on stripping the room of its furniture, leaving only her easel, her paints, and a single hard-backed wooden chair for Jae-hyun. She wanted him uncomfortable. She wanted him to feel the bite of the wood against his spine, the way she had felt the bite of the Paris wind for 20 years. The sessions were grueling. She didn't let him speak. She didn't let him check his phone. She simply stared. It was a clinical, predatory gaze. Milan sat on her stool, her eyes darting from his temple to the line of his jaw, then back to the canvas where she slashed violent, dark strokes. She was looking for the cracks in the titan. She analyzed the fine wrinkles around his eyes, proof of sleepless nights, and the way his mouth tightened into a thin, bloodless line whenever their eyes met. It was a game of psychological chicken. Jae-hyun sat perfectly still, his breathing shallow. He watched her work with a hunger he couldn't hide, his eyes tracking the movement of her throat when she swallowed, the focus in her brow. He was suffering under her scrutiny, yet he seemed to relish it, as if her gaze was the only thing making him feel real. One afternoon, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic scritch of her palette knife. Milan reached for a filbert brush, but her fingers, slick with linseed oil, fumbled. The brush clattered to the floor, rolling toward Jae-hyun's feet. Both reached for it at the same time. Their hands met on the cold marble. Milan froze. It was the first time they had touched in 2 decades. Jae-hyun's skin was hot, burning, against hers. As he lunged forward, the cuff of his bespoke silk shirt rode up his right arm. Milan's breath hitched. Wrapped around his wrist and extending down toward the thumb was a horrific, jagged mess of scar tissue. It wasn't a clean surgical line. It was a crush injury, raised, ropey, and white against his skin, as if the bones beneath had once been pulverized. Jae-hyun ripped his arm back with violent speed, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. He yanked the cuff down, buttoning it with trembling fingers. "What was that?" Milan whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That scar. That wasn't from a fall." "An accident," Jae-hyun snapped, his voice brittle. "A factory inspection years ago. It's nothing." "It looks like someone tried to break you," she said, stepping closer. "I said it's nothing, Milan. Get back to the canvas." He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the window, his back to her, but she could see his reflection in the glass. He was shaking. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had survived a torture chamber. The Hansong Foundation gala was a sea of black ties and diamond necklaces. Jae-hyun moved through the crowd like a shark through water, silent, lethal, and utterly dominant. He kept Milan at his side, his hand firmly on the small of her back. It felt like protection. It felt like ownership. Milan hated it. She felt like a trophy he had won in a war she didn't know they were fighting. She watched the way the most powerful men in Korea bowed their heads to him, their voices trembling with a mixture of respect and pure, unadulterated fear. To them, Jae-hyun was a monster, a machine of logic and ruthlessness. Near the champagne fountain, a group of investors from the old guard stood huddled together. One of them, a man flushed red with too much cognac, stared at Milan with blatant disdain. "I don't understand the chairman's new hobby," the man sneered in loud, drunken English, assuming Milan was just another silent ornament. "Bringing a foreigner into the inner sanctum, a black girl from the streets of Paris, to paint the face of Hansong? It's a blemish on the legacy. He should have hired a real artist." The air in the immediate circle turned to liquid nitrogen. Jae-hyun didn't raise his voice. He didn't cause a scene. He simply turned his head. He walked over to the man, leaning in close, his mouth inches from the investor's ear. Milan couldn't hear the words, but she saw the man's face drain of color. His glass began to rattle against his saucer. Within seconds, the man turned, stumbling toward the exit. He didn't just leave the party. By the next morning, his shares were liquidated and his family had moved to Singapore. In the car ride back to the penthouse, the silence was different. The adrenaline of the gala had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating exhaustion. Jae-hyun leaned his head against the cool glass of the window. For the first time, he let the mask drop. He fell asleep as the city lights blurred past. Milan watched him. She looked at the silver at his temples, the deep shadows under his eyes, and the way his scarred hand lay limp in his lap. She realized then that the penthouse wasn't his castle. The suits weren't his armor. They were his cage. He wasn't a king ruling a kingdom. He was a prisoner serving a life sentence in a palace of glass. The typhoon hit Seoul at 2 a.m. The wind howled against the Hansong Tower, making the massive structure groan. Inside the penthouse, the lights flickered and died, plunged into the orange-gray glow of the city's emergency streetlights below. Milan found Jae-hyun in the gallery. He wasn't in his suit. He wore a simple black t-shirt, and he was holding a bottle of expensive scotch. He was standing in front of the blue loft. "You should be in bed," Milan said softly, her voice muffled by the thunder. "I hated this painting." Jae-hyun slurred, his voice thick with alcohol. He pointed the bottle at the canvas. For 20 years, I looked at it every night, and I hated it. Milan walked up beside him. Then why keep it? Why put yourself through this? Because it was the last time I saw you smile, he whispered, turning to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with the grief so profound it made Milan's chest ache. Do you have any idea how hard it is? To spend every waking hour ensuring you are successful, ensuring you are safe, only to watch you become the world's greatest artist because of how much you hate me? He stepped into her space, the smell of scotch and sorrow radiating off him. I am the villain of your story, Milan. I know that. I wrote the script. He moved closer, pinning her between his body and the wall where her paintings hung. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. He looked at her lips with a desperation that was almost violent. He inhaled deeply, his eyes fluttering shut. You smell like linseed oil in the rain, he rasped. I've missed that smell more than I've missed my own soul. He leaned in. His lips were an inch from hers. Milan could feel the heat of his skin, the frantic beat of his heart against her ribs. She should have pushed him away. She should have slapped him. But she stayed, her own breath hitching in anticipation of the collision. At the last possible second, Jae-hyun froze. He opened his eyes, and for a heartbeat, she saw the boy from Paris, the one who loved poetry. Then the ice returned. He let out a choked, self-loathing sound and pulled back, stumbling away from her. I can't, he whispered, wiping his face with his hand. I'm still the villain, Milan. Don't let me forget that. Don't let me think I deserve this. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Milan alone in the storm, her lips tingling and her heart shattered in a way she hadn't felt in 20 years. Seoul, the final week. The penthouse was a tomb of glass and silence. After the night of the storm, Jae-hyun had become a ghost in his own home, avoiding Milan's gaze, his presence marked only by the scent of scotch left in empty rooms. Milan couldn't sleep. Her skin felt too tight. Her mind was a distorted loop of the scar on his wrist and the broken look in his eyes. At 3 a.m., driven by a feverish compulsion, she walked toward his private study, the only room she was strictly forbidden to enter. The door was heavy mahogany, contrasting with the glass of the rest of the apartment. It wasn't locked. The room smelled of old paper and leather. It was a workspace built for a man who never intended to rest. On the far wall, behind a sliding panel of bookshelves, sat a digital safe. Milan stared at the keypad. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of their life in Paris. She thought of the only numbers that had ever mattered to them. She punched in the date of their first meeting, September 14th, 1999. The lock clicked. The door swung open. There was no gold inside, no stacks of one or bearer bonds. There was a single, thick leather binder labeled in Korean. Inside were plastic sleeves, each containing a piece of a life she thought she had lived alone. Her hands shook as she flipped the pages. There were medical records from a clinic in Chicago. The surgery she'd had to remove a benign tumor 2 years after he left. She had been terrified and broke, but a mystery donor had cleared the bill. There were photos, hundreds of them. Milan at her first small gallery opening. Milan walking her dog in Brooklyn. Milan crying at a funeral for her mentor. He hadn't just watched her, he had guarded her from across an ocean. Then she reached the final page. It was a legal document, yellowed and stamped with the Hansung seal, addendum to succession. She read the translated notes in the margins, her blood turning to ice. The contract was dated the exact day he had destroyed their Paris attic. It was an agreement between Jae-hyun and his father, Chairman Han. The subject, Milan, shall remain untouched. Her physical person, specifically her ability to pursue her craft, is guaranteed protection from Han Seong's enforcement divisions. In exchange, the heir, Jae-hyun, agrees to total severance, immediate return to Seoul, and absolute obedience to the chairman's directive. Below the signature was a handwritten note from the fixer. The heir hesitated. Corrective measure applied to his right hand as a reminder of the price of failure. He took the strike meant for the girl. Agreement finalized. Milan collapsed onto the floor, the binder clutched to her chest. The accident, the crush injury, the scar wasn't a factory mishap. His father had used a hammer on him to prove he could do it to her. Jae-hyun hadn't left her because he was bored. He had offered himself up as a sacrificial lamb so she could keep her hands. He had let her hate him for 20 years so she would be free to paint. "You idiot," she sobbed into the dark. "You beautiful, selfless idiot." The grand ballroom of the Hansong Tower was packed with international press, art critics, and the board of directors. At the front of the room, a massive canvas sat on a dais, covered in a heavy velvet shroud. Jae-hyun stood at the podium. He looked like the man the world expected, cold, invincible, and terrifyingly powerful. His suit was a dark, midnight navy, his face an impenetrable mask of stone. He expected a portrait of a titan. He expected a painting that would cement his legacy of ruthlessness. 20 years ago, I met an artist in Paris, Jae-hyun said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. I asked her to capture the man I've become. Today, we see the result. He stepped down and gestured to Milan. Milan walked onto the stage. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her hands, those hands he had saved, were steady. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the board. She looked only at Jae-hyun. "This is not a portrait of a chairman," Milan said, her voice trembling with a raw electric intensity. "This is a portrait of a debt." She grabbed the velvet cloth and pulled. The room went silent. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The painting was not red. For the first time in 2 decades, Milan had used blue. Not just any blue, the deep, soulful Prussian blue of their Paris attic. The canvas showed Jae-hyun, but he wasn't wearing a suit. He was painted from the waist up, his shirt open, revealing the galaxy she had once painted on his skin. He wasn't looking at the viewer with the cold eyes of a CEO. He was looking through the canvas with a vulnerability so profound it was painful to witness. His right hand, the scarred one, was held open toward the light, rendered in such exquisite detail that every mark of his sacrifice was visible. He looked beautiful. He looked broken. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 20 years and had finally let it out. At the bottom of the canvas, in bold, elegant script, was the title, "The Boy Who Saved Me." The cameras began to flash like 1,000 dying stars, but Jae-hyun didn't notice. He was frozen. He stared at the painting, his composure not just cracking, but disintegrating. The mask he had worn for 20 years shattered in front of the entire world. He looked at the blue on the canvas, the color of hope, the color of their youth, and his eyes filled with tears. He turned his head slowly toward Milan, who was standing at the edge of the stage, her face wet with her own tears. The press, the money, the board, the scandal, none of it existed. "Milan," he breathed, the name a prayer he had been forbidden to speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, crying, looking at him with the same love she had felt in a freezing attic in 1999. In that moment, the 20-year void didn't just close, it vanished. The betrayal was gone. Only the truth remained. The aftermath of the unveiling was not a celebration. It was a war zone. While the art world scrambled to decode the blue portrait, the upper floors of the Hansong Tower vibrated with the silent, lethal fury of a dying dynasty. In his private office, Jae-hyun watched the monitors. His father, Chairman Han, was calling from an undisclosed medical suite, his face on the screen a map of age and malice. "You've turned our legacy into a soap opera," the old man wheezed, his voice a dry rattle. "You think that painting makes you a hero? It makes you a target. I've already triggered the contingency, Jae-hyun. By tomorrow morning, the news cycles will be flooded with evidence that your artist stole her early designs from our archives. I will ruin her name, her career, and her hands, this time through the courts, unless you take the stage, retract the sentiment, and commit her to a psych ward for obsessive delusions." Jae-hyun leaned back in his leather chair. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of the chairman's expectations. He felt nothing but a terrifying, beautiful clarity. "You still think I care about the legacy, father," Jae-hyun said softly. "You are Han-seong. Without it, you are a ghost." "Then watch a ghost haunt you." Jae-hyun stood up and walked toward the boardroom. The directors were already gathered, panicked, watching the stock prices dip. Jae-hyun didn't take the head of the table. He stood by the window, looking out at the city he had helped build, a city built on the bones of his own happiness. "I am liquidating my personal shares," Jae-hyun announced. The room went dead silent. "Effective immediately. I am also releasing the Vault 7 files to the Blue House and the National Tax Service." The directors gasped. Vault 7 contained 30 years of the chairman's bribery, tax evasion, and enforcement receipts, including the contract regarding Milan. "You'll go to prison with him," one director screamed. "Perhaps," Jae-hyun replied, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips, "but I'll be the one holding the match. If Han-seong is the weapon you use to hurt her, then Han-seong must cease to exist." By sunset, the Titan of Seoul had committed corporate suicide. He dismantled his father's empire in a single afternoon, burning through billions in assets to pay off whistleblowers and ensure the chairman would spend his final years in a courtroom. He didn't fight to save his title. He fought to burn the bridge behind him so that he could never be forced to cross it again. 3 days later, the Han-seong penthouse was unrecognizable. The marble floors were bare. The Italian furniture had been hauled away. The walls, once a museum of Milan's grief, were nothing but white, echoing spaces. Jae-hyun had donated every single painting, millions of dollars of art, to the National Museum of Korea, under one condition: the Milan collection must always be free to the public. He stood in the center of the living room, a single duffel bag at his feet. He wore the same kind of simple black sweater he had worn in Paris. The armor was gone. The Titan was dead. He looked at his right hand. It still shook, a rhythmic reminder of the price he had paid. He was prepared to disappear. He had left a letter and the deed to the blue loft at Milan's hotel. He assumed she was already halfway to New York, fleeing the chaos he had created. He deserved to be alone. It was the only ending that made sense for a man who had spent 20 years dealing in lies. He reached for his bag, but a sound at the heavy front door stopped him. The door creaked open. Milan stood there. She wasn't dressed for a flight. She wore paint-stained jeans and an oversized shirt. In her arms, she wasn't carrying luggage. She was holding a wooden box of brushes and a fresh, pristine roll of canvas. They stood 30 feet apart in the empty, echoing room. "You have nothing left, Jae-hyun," she said. Her voice wasn't cold anymore. It was thick with a gravity that pulled at his soul. "The news says you're a pariah. The banks took the tower. Your father is in custody. You're a man without a name." Jae-hyun looked down at his scarred wrist, then back at her. The deadness in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, terrifying honesty. "I have my hands," he replied, his voice rough, "and you have yours. That was the only deal that mattered." Milan walked across the empty marble, her footsteps echoing like heartbeats. She didn't stop until she was inches from him. She set her box of brushes on the floor and looked up at him. Not as the artist looking at a subject, but as the girl looking at her boy. "You're an idiot," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and racing down her cheek. "You spent 20 years alone in this glass box." "I was waiting for the world to be safe for you," he said. Milan didn't wait for another word. She stepped forward, reaching out to take his scarred hand. She didn't flinch at the ropey tissue. She kissed the scar, her lips warm and lingering against the mark of his sacrifice. Then she took that hand and placed it firmly on her waist, pulling him toward her. "I never liked the penthouse view anyway," she whispered against his lips, her breath hitching. "It's too sterile. It needs more color." She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. When their lips finally met, it wasn't the tentative kiss of teenagers or the desperate near miss of the storm. It was a collision. It was 20 years of unspoken poetry, of hidden letters, of red paint and blue tears. It was the taste of a debt finally paid in full. Jae-hyun let out a broken sob into her mouth, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that suggested he would never, ever let go. For the first time in 2 decades, the air in the room didn't feel recycled. It felt like oxygen. They stood in the center of the ruins of his empire, 2 middle-aged survivors who had finally found their way back to the attic. They didn't speak of the scandal, or the money, or the years lost. They just breathed the same air, their foreheads pressed together, finally safe in the quiet. In the center of the vast, empty room, a single wooden easel stood facing the window. On it rested a blank white canvas. The sun began to set over Seoul, casting a long golden light across the floor. The red was gone. The blue had faded into the twilight. The canvas was empty, waiting for the first stroke of a story that belonged only to them. The Mediterranean coast. 1 year later. The villa was small, whitewashed, and perched precariously on a jagged cliff overlooking the Alboran Sea. It was a place the world didn't care about, far from the gleaming glass towers of Seoul and the frantic galleries of Manhattan. There were no assistants here, no PR agents, no security details. There was only the sound of the tide and the smell of jasmine. Milan stood on the terrace, her skin glowing under the warm Andalusian sun. She was pinning a fresh canvas to a makeshift wooden frame. She looked younger now at 40 than she had at 30. The Ice Queen had melted, leaving behind a woman who laughed loudly and slept until noon. Inside the house, she heard the low, melodic hum of a voice. She turned to see Jae-hyun stepping out onto the terrace. He was barefoot, wearing linen trousers and a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The sharp, predatory edge of the CEO was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded stillness. He carried 2 cups of espresso and a bowl of local peaches. He put the bowl of peaches on the table and walked over to her, but he didn't set the coffee down. Instead, he stood behind her, his chest pressing against her back, and draped his arms around her waist. Milan leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes. "You're distracting the artist," she murmured, though she made no move to pull away. "The artist has been staring at a blank canvas for 20 minutes, Jae-hyun teased, his voice vibrating against her spine. He kissed the side of her neck, his lips lingering on a pulse point. "I thought you might need a muse." Milan turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She felt the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a heart that no longer had to hide. She looked down at his right hand, the one wrapped around her waist. The scar was still there, a pale map of his sacrifice, but the tremors had almost entirely stopped. Peace, it turned out, was the best medicine. "I was thinking about the gallery in Seoul," she said softly. Jae-hyun's expression didn't darken at the mention of the city. "The Milan and Jae-hyun Youth Center?" "They sent photos this morning. The first class of scholarship students started their residency. There's a girl there, Jay. She's 16, from a rough part of Busan. She paints with so much fire it reminded me of us. Jae-hyun pulled her closer, his chin resting on top of her head. Then the burn was worth it. Every bit of it. He had truly let it all go. The Hansong name was a footnote in history now. The company restructured and stripped of the Han family's influence. His father had died in a private hospital 6 months ago. Still bitter, still alone. Jae-hyun had attended the funeral, stood for 10 minutes in silence, and then walked away without looking back. He hadn't inherited a cent, and he didn't care. Between Milan's royalties and the modest savings he tucked away outside his father's reach, they had more than enough. "What are you going to paint today?" he asked, stepping back to let her work. Milan picked up a palette knife. She looked at the sea, where the deep turquoise of the water met the pale, shimmering cerulean of the sky. "I'm done with the red period," she said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "And I think I've said all I need to say in blue." She reached for a tube of paint she hadn't touched in a long time. She squeezed a dollop onto her palette. It was a vibrant, blindingly bright gold. "I want to paint the light," she said. "The way it looks when it hits the water. The way it looks when it hits your face in the morning. I want to paint how it feels to finally be awake." Jae-hyun sat in a wicker chair nearby, picking up a book of poetry. He didn't read it silently. He began to read aloud, his voice competing with the sound of the waves. "And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Milan began to paint. She worked with a new kind of intensity, not the frantic energy of someone trying to outrun a demon, but the deliberate grace of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. Hours passed in a blurred symphony of color and verse. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of violet and apricot. As the light turned amber, Jae-hyun stood up and walked to the easel. He didn't look at the painting. He looked at Milan. He reached out and took the brush from her hand, setting it down on the tray. 20 years, he whispered, pulling her into a slow, swaying dance on the terrace. "We spent 20 years waiting for the world to stop. And now it has." "We're not teenagers anymore, Jay," Milan said, her arms looping around his neck. "We have wrinkles. We have scars. We lost so much time." Jae-hyun stopped dancing. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "We didn't lose it," he said firmly. "We were forged by it. I loved the girl in the attic, Milan. I truly did. But I worshiped the woman on this terrace. Every year we spent apart was a price I would pay 1,000 times over just to stand here with you right now, knowing that no one, not my father, not the world, can ever tell us no again." He kissed her then, a deep, slow, and certain kiss that tasted like the future. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky over the Mediterranean, the two of them sat on the edge of the terrace, legs dangling over the cliffside. They didn't need to speak. The silence wasn't a prison anymore. It was a conversation. On the easel behind them, the painting of the light was drying. It was a masterpiece of gold and warmth, a visual record of a love that had survived the dark and come out on the other side, glowing. They had met as teenagers. They had suffered as shadows. But as the moon rose over the sea, they finally existed. Vibrant, colorful, and whole. The end. Thank you for watching. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.